Now, I have many stories I would like to share with you about my research. It all starts with my research into my grandfather and people who somehow crossed his path. Sometimes that leads me to big, grand stories, like the last episode I recorded talking about the German East Asia Squadron, a major constitutional crisis and clash between the New Zealand Prime Minister and the Governor. On other occasions, it's much more smaller, shall we say, and much more personal. And today, it's one of those smaller scale stories that I want to share with you. And I've called it Mystery Man, the Troopship Maunganui crewman living under a false name. So the Maunganui was the troopship that carried my grandfather to war, leaving New Zealand in October of 1914. And this mystery man was a crew member on that same ship. Now, the picture you see here could, in theory, be him, that fellow at the bottom of the screen, because we don't have any images of him. We don't have any photos of what he looked like, so we can just use our imagination. Now, I first encountered the existence of this mystery fellow when I was reading the letters written by Clyde Giles to his father in Sydney. Now, if you did watch my last episode about the delayed departure of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force from New Zealand in 1914, you will have already seen me quoting Clyde Giles, who was a crew member aboard the Maunganui and was getting rather bored and sick of Wellington while he was waiting. Here's a few select quotes. "I've seen more drunken men here in the 3 weeks than I've ever seen. Don't think New Zealand will ever get over it, as they are such holy joes. National prohibition will go through flying next election, I should say, after this. I'm jolly glad to be going. I'm sick of the sight of Wellington. There's absolutely nothing to see and nowhere to go." And presumably he was hanging around with this mystery guy at the time he was writing this. Now, I actually learned about the existence of this guy when I was reading some much later letters from Giles. In fact, it was a letter written in March 1918 that alerted me to the existence of this mystery. Here's what he had to say. It goes on for several pages, but bear with me. I think it's interesting and worth reading it. So here's what he wrote to his father. "Received one letter of yours last night, dated the 5th of Jan. I was awfully sorry to hear that Sloane had been killed. Had been wondering why he didn't write me. Little did I know he had paid the price. You're wondering why you were notified of his death. Well, I shall try to explain as far as I can. Sloane wasn't his name. His proper name was O'Kane. Why it was changed, I don't know. We were great pals on the Maunganui, but he didn't tell me any of his past history, and I never asked for it. Well, when we sailed on the Maunganui with the troops, and that was in October of 1914, Sloane made a will, and it was left with the public trustees in Wellington, New Zealand. I don't know what he had to leave or anything else, but he said at the time, if anything happens to me, that you will be notified. So that was all. I never asked what he wanted me to do or anything else. As you know, I intended joining the first lot in Egypt had I been able to get discharged. As a matter of fact, we both did. We were going to try. Stick together. In other words, as civilian crew members on a troop ship, they were in fact not even allowed to enlist in the army because they were considered essential workers. And they had a major labor shortage because, of course, most of the young men in those jobs actually wanted to quit their jobs working on the ship and join the army. Both these men managed to get out of it after the voyage to Egypt, and that left them free to enlist. You know what happened. We couldn't get our discharge. Well, when I asked for my discharge to go back to Sydney and enlist, Sloane got his also. But he had a few words with the manager in Dunedin about some trifling thing, then refused to use the pass that was given to him to get across to Sydney, and said he'd join up in New Zealand instead. I didn't see him again until we met in Egypt, and then only saw him for one night. And I was happy to say I was able to confirm the existence of the author of this letter. This is Arthur Clyde Giles, but he always signs his letters to his father Clyde. I guess he went by his middle name. And the crucial detail we have there is his enlistment date. He enlisted in June of 1915, so that was when he managed to get back to Australia, get out of his duties on the cargo ship, and actually join the Australian military. His letter carries on. Then the New Zealanders went out from Cairo and had a bit of a scrap. Well, I saw no more of him until last September when I met him by accident in a place called Vaux-Bequin, France. I absolutely am sure I butchered the pronunciation of that name, but you can see on the map I've shown you roughly where it is. Again, pretty close to some other significant place names in the history of World War I. And this photo from the Imperial War Museum shows British troops marching through that location in 1915. We had a good talk, as you may depend. Well, he told me he had altered his will before coming away and gave me to understand that I was interested in it. He also said, if I get killed, this watch I have is to go to you. But he said, come in one day alone, and I shall tell you all about things you will know. Then what you must have often wondered, like in other words, come and talk to me alone and I'll tell you the truth about who I am and how I came to be here. Well, the next time I went in, the New Zealanders had gone to the line. I missed him. When I was wounded, I wrote to him from England and told him I was out of action and gave him my address. He wrote back, but in the meantime, I had been moved. His letter was written in November, I think. I didn't get it until the 9th of December. He said he was coming across on leave and asked me to write and let him know my movements, as he would like to see me while he was across. It was also agreed we were both going to his, and he crossed that out and replaced it with some people in Ireland, if we could get leave together. Don't know if they were his relations or not. Well, I wrote straight back when I received his letter, but got no answer, heard nothing more of him until I received your letter last night. So now I've written to the New Zealand Base Records for further detail, if they can give me any. In other words, it was Giles's father in Sydney who got a notification of the death of this person. And of course, it was a big puzzle to him because why am I being notified of the death of this guy I've never met? So now you know all I know. Now, what can we work out from everything he had to say? Well, he gave us a few more clues. Bob gave me the address of a Mrs. S.A. Timpany, Supreme Court Hotel, Queenstown, Otago, New Zealand, and asked me to write to her in the event of his being killed. I don't know if she's a relation or not. And that is actually the Supreme Court Hotel in Queenstown. I was actually quite delighted that I was able to find a photo of the building. I am in a bit of a puzzle to know just what to do. But should you get anything else from New Zealand, you'll know what the strength of the thing is, and that is as far as I can tell. I will leave it to you to do what you think best. Write the trustees and see what the will contains, or let things go. It's very awkward, as I am so far away. The name he enlisted under was R.H. Sloane, and that was the name he said to give this Miss Timpany. This reads a bit like a penny dreadful, doesn't it? I shall get what information I can about his death across here, then should anyone want any further particulars, shall be able to let them know all that I know. And if you're not aware of what a penny dreadful is, it was a nickname given to basically trash paperbacks, pulp fiction in the 19th century in England. So this really intrigued me. I thought, can I work out who he is? What's his real name? What's he doing there? What was the dreadful secret that he wasn't willing to tell anybody except maybe a really good friend if he came alone. Well, what do we know? Well, according to Giles, he enlisted under the name R.H. Sloan, and he also calls him at one point Bob. So it seems to be a pretty reasonable conclusion that the R is short for Robert, Bob being an abbreviation of Robert. He says that his real name was O'Kane. He says that he enlisted in New Zealand, and he mentions this Mrs. S.A. Timpany at an address in Queenstown. Now, and also the passing reference that he might possibly have had some Irish relatives. Now, of course, that got me thinking all sorts of thoughts, scandals and all the rest. An address at a hotel. A Mrs. Timpany. Well, it's clearly not his wife. It's not his mother because she doesn't have the same last name as him. I'm wondering if there's some sordid story of brothels and prostitution and who knows what. And the picture in the background, incidentally, was from ancient Rome. It was from Pompeii, and you can now find it in the Archaeology Museum in Naples. So was that what was going on? Well, no, it wasn't, but it took me quite a while to prove it. There was nothing sordid or scandalous from this point of view, at least. So my next big hope was the New Zealand Government Archives. Could I find his military file if he enlisted in New Zealand? Well, I went through all of the Sloans, and there was nobody that fit that description. And I was about to give up, but then I had an inspiration, and I thought, what if Giles spelled his name wrong? And so I tried looking up Sloan without an E. And ding, 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 I found the military file. And here we have it. Rifleman Sloan, crossed out, O'Kane, with a K, not a C. Robert Henry. I was right about the R standing for Robert. And we've got his service number and all of the rest. And right at the top of the sheet, written across in red pen, it says, enlisted under assumed name of Sloan, Robert Henry. Statutory declaration proves correct name to be O'Kane, Robert Henry. And then we have other things to confirm the story of our friend Clyde Giles. He did indeed give Clyde Giles, as his next of kin, a friend, care of his father in Sydney, Australia. There he is. And then we have confirmation of his death. He was killed in action in Belgium on the 4th of December, 1917. And there's not that much more we can learn about him from his military file. I thought this was quite interesting, or perhaps amusing. He was appointed cook in March of 1916, and 10 days later he was fired, or says he relinquished his duties as cook. So did that mean he was a pretty bad cook and he got fired from his job? I don't know, but I thought that was a minor detail that was halfway amusing. And that also got me digging to see where he would have died, and the answer actually in this case, given the date, was pretty clear. There was a failed New Zealand attack that led to heavy casualties in the New Zealand infantry, over 500 dead or wounded, and of those 500, more than 100 of them were killed. So it's pretty clear where he met his end. Now, this still doesn't answer the question, what was his dreadful secret? Why was he hiding? Why was he under a fake name? Well, perhaps one clue is on his attestation paper. Under the question, are you married? And he answered no. However, when you go to his military file, written in that same red pen, which means extra details were being added later, they were the corrections we saw when they got his real name, we see that he actually did have a wife who lived in Invercargill at the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand, and he had married her in 1908. And he had 3 children, Marie, Rose, and Leslie. The last born was born in March of 1912. So here he is, going to sea under a fake name, saying he's not married. Well, I'm speculating here, but I'm guessing that he walked out on his wife and his kids and was deeply ashamed of it, and that's why he didn't want to tell anyone. And with that guilty conscience, he wanted to talk to his friend Giles, but he was killed in the battle before he ever had the chance. And then also in the file, here we have the answer to who was this Mrs. S. Timpany, because the statutory declaration was written by her. She says, I was the mother of Robert Henry O'Kane. He attested with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force under the assumed name of Robert Henry Sloane on the 30th day of May 1915 and served with the NZEF with the regimental number 231187 and was reported killed in action in October 1917. Well, that's not quite correct. It was in fact December, but never mind. That Robert Henry O'Kane and Robert Henry Sloane were one and the same person, and that his true name was Robert Henry O'Kane. And that just leaves a few minor points to tie up. Why was she Mrs. Timpany instead of Mrs. O'Kane? Well, that was easy enough to find from Past Papers New Zealand. She had lost her first husband when he died at age 28. They immigrated from Ireland together, so there were indeed family in Ireland probably. And then she married again to Mr. J. Timpany in 1897. Her first husband, Thomas, and Sarah had had two children. They'd lost their daughter when she was 16 years old to TB. And Bob, well, he was our mystery man. He was killed on the Western Front in December of 1917. She did have one further son from her second marriage. I do not know what happened to him. And finally, I found the gravestone of our mystery man. And there it is, even written in stone, about what was his fake name and what was his real name. R. H. O'Kane, who served as Rifleman R. Sloane when he went to war. Well, what was he running from? What was he hiding from? I've made a few guesses. I don't know. But all the same, let's just end by saying, rest in peace, Bob.